AI.
Now I know we're in the middle of this crazy, rapidly shifting zeitgeist where things are changing literally like every hour. We have a new ChatGPT, we have Midjourney, we have Stable Diffusion, predictive technology, and blah, blah, blah. You already know this. Recently, I was on an underwater basket weaving forum and came across something interesting. In full disclosure, I was like huge into like nerdy gaming shit back in the day, and it's so weird looking back. Early 2000s, late 90s, games like Deus Ex, whatever. How, in retrospect, how spot on they were with eerily predictive storylines, almost to the point where you go down that rabbit hole, and yeah, let's just say they were ahead of the time. So fast forward a little bit later when I first played as a kid, Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, that came out on November 13th, 2001. So we're talking like directly post 9/11, which is insane in and of itself. At the end of the game, there's this mind-blowing sequence where the protagonist is going head-to-head against this super powerful AI entity that's pretty much talking about ruling the world. And there's this great video out there by this guy named Max Derrick, I think, that's called The Most Profound Moments in Gaming History. Definitely well worth checking out if you're into that crazy shit.
Here, the AI illustrates the various ways in which human error corrupts truth. That human error arises from an instinctual drive to protect ourselves emotionally and physically, which truth tends to threaten.
Anyway, back to the underwater basket weaving forum, and this is what I found. All right, so everyone keeps shitting themselves over baseline gender politics. Nobody aware enough of automatic intelligence feedback loops controlling the market and the market moving to content marketing method, which means the market is mainly selling narratives, which means automatic intelligence feedback loops are selling narratives, which means literal fucking abstract mathematic algorithms are in charge of the proliferation of culture since religion is fading out and there's no longer a common cultural narrative. So fanatics turn into neo-corporate idolatry and the marketers don't realize they're playing with fire, and sooner than later a crowd of disgruntled fanatics are going to come close to, if not outright kill someone like the Frenchies back in 08. How about in English, Einstein? Deus Ex was right again. Okay, so back in the day, some computer nerds made machines that would take in a bunch of outside data, process it, and try to predict the future. To fund it, they predominantly sold the information to people who wanted to buy and sell stocks. Enough people started doing that they started making the machines send out stock reports themselves, which other machines took in as data to further sell it, buy, and report on stocks themselves. This eventually created a massive feedback loop of stock data being managed by automatic intelligence, not the same as artificial intelligence, that outright blocked out the human element, and right now the open secret is that the market is out of human control. If anyone tried to remove these data loops, even one out of sync chain link could cause the world economy to collapse overnight. You're following me so far? In tandem with this technology, the internet happened and a load of marketers started moving into content marketing, which is the idea that the product and the marketing are the same thing and you're selling a lifestyle story, which is why if you pay attention, most companies that used to just sell a product have made massive investments into media space. This is fine in and of itself. The 80s had a similar version of this. The problem is that the easy proliferation of consumer data reaches those automatic intelligences and they begin to report on what kind of narratives sell versus which ones don't. Simple, right? Well, not really. You see, we live in a post-hyper-normalization world, a Soviet term for propaganda that keeps saying something when the reality is different. When you mix in marketing and propaganda with feedback loops, add on top of that Google's ad program that essentially bubbles people into feedback loops and only gives them what they want to hear so you can sell something, it basically creates a mass psychological dissonance between different groups of people that, consciously or not, have their life's context form around media narratives. It's one reason why the social justice stuff is hitting so hard now, despite the fact that America is an otherwise pretty prosperous country with no major problems causing anyone to starve. Anyway, the implication is that you basically have cultural narrative context being created by literal, abstract machinations who may or may not be intelligent. That's no good because there's no moral parameters to stop the data from trying to get everyone to kill each other. See, people keep thinking the robot revolution is going to be Terminator, but in all reality, it's probably going to be more like The Shining. So, people have their lives contextualized by inhuman machinations, which, okay, it's pretty bleak but not outright destructive, right? Just a bunch of consumers being taken for a ride, right? Well, no. You see, the consequence of religion more or less falling out of style in the public consciousness is that there's no longer a single common cultural narrative. So you just don't get to see Tim at Sunday school, so what? Well, the larger point of contention is that there's always been a considerable percentage of any population that gives away to fanatic behavior, which in antiquity used to mean religious fanaticism, but if the narrative of religion is weakened, and the only other alternatives to narrative are automatically generated content marketing narratives too shallow to really make a lifestyle out of, you run into a phenomenon where a percentage of the population essentially migrated between brands in a pseudo-idolatrous methodology. When you really come down to it, a fan base is literally just the same thing as a cult. They both act as a community that brings people together to discuss a specific narrative, except the religious ones that actually at least try to offer the illusion of being beneficial to society at large. While the automatic models basically are there purely for profit and offer hedonistic sensory overload to compensate for any shallowness. Did you ever stop to think about how we live in a world where a bunch of people do crazy shit over cartoons, harass people, send death threats, sell cars for sauce, etc.? Do you really think that's just normal behavior? No, these sorts of people would have been in a fucking monastery a couple hundred years ago. They're fanatics, plain and simple. Nothing wrong with being a fanatic if it's constructive, but these narratives don't have that interest in mind. So to put it bluntly, we quite literally live in a society where abstract mathematical formulas are in charge of a market that pretty much doesn't sell products anymore and is more focused on selling narrative scams based on the parameters from those algorithms, and a bunch of wackos who in another lifetime would have been witch burners who have nothing to spiritually satisfy their intrinsic obsessive tendencies are replacing a common cultural narrative with many different smaller ones in different tribes, which is how you end up with Nazis and commies in a prosperous capitalist country thinking the world is going to end next week, literally creating their own problems. One could argue that we have too much freedom of choice when it comes to information about narratives, and it's actively harming the society. The Russians used avant-garde techniques in their propaganda to give the population so much bizarre data to sift through, they just conform with no real goal in mind. The Chinese just censor and have overall less data to feed their population, but Americans simultaneously have too much data and too little diversity in the data, making it easy for context to corral them into specific mindsets. All it takes is a pair of eyes to see that the current mindset for the American populations is apathetic versus messiah complex murderousness. The silver lining is I think these marketers don't know they're playing with fire. I don't think it's entirely out of the question that someday soon a crowd of angry people will actually lynch content creators for not towing their own narrative complex, and very soon they may begin to live in fear. People think this sexual harassment stuff is a big happening, but I think it's only going to be a drop in a larger bucket that will be the 2020s. If not apocalyptic, they'll be interesting times. Yeah. So evidently this was written maybe in 2019 or so. I don't... 2017. So I don't know. With all that being said, it's a lot to take in, but I think many of us have already lived through a lot of collective societal turmoil and trauma that it's almost sad to say, yeah, this hyper-normalization and desensitization of very important, impactful events and transitions into a new age are something sort of, it's exhausting, you know, it's just one of those things you really have to be wary, definitely meditate on who you are as an individual, what you stand for, and basically don't get lost in the sauce. There's a lot of sauce out there and it's very easy to get lost in, and the fact of the matter is every single day we're waking up and there's something transformative, something new, something traumatic, something sensory overload every single day, and reading things like this just kind of reminds me of that and to be very aware, you know, but still keep your sanity and define what is healthy for you as an individual moving forward, because it's going to be a very interesting decade. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. Thanks for sticking around and Godspeed. Stay frosty.